Estimate the internet bandwidth needed for 1,000 graduate students. I'm here today with Rakesh, a PM at Microsoft, to do a estimation mock interview. Rakesh, do you mind introducing yourself to those watching?
Yes, thanks, Kevin. It's great to be here. Hey everyone, I'm Rakesh. I'm currently a PM at Microsoft. I work on the Apple ecosystem mostly. Previously, I've been at companies such as Google as a TPM and SpaceX and a few other YC companies. But I'm looking forward to today's interview.
If you're enjoying this video, you can watch dozens more of videos like this at tryexponent.com. Check out our real interview questions with full written solutions. Over 1 million people use Exponent to ace their interviews in product management, software engineering, engineering management, machine learning, data science, and much, much more. Get started for free at tryexponent.com.
So let's get into it. The question I'd love to ask you today is estimate the internet bandwidth needed for 1,000 graduate students.
The question I have is there are many types of graduate students, right? There are people within the medical field, there are people within computer science, there are people within liberal arts, and many other fields. And the question itself is going to be dependent on what type of students we choose. So, for the scope of this question, at least, would you say that it's fair to assume or choose liberal arts students as the category that we want to pursue?
Can you tell me more behind that rationale?
Yes. This is just anecdotal, most anecdotal kind of thing. But I think when I was at undergrad university, a majority of the students at the University of Michigan were liberal arts majors. I think it encompassed at least 40+%, where you had all the other majors combined into more smaller kind of aggregates. So the reason why I chose that was everywhere you go, you see a liberal arts major. It's mostly because the courses are so vast and popular that many students love the program. So just wanted to choose that as a good
Sure.
kind of majority point, at least.
Sure,
Perfect.
sure. And I think you might be also alluding to the level of usage of one's computer, when you're more inside of a classroom setting for the majority of your time and also doing a lot of computer related tasks such as writing, etc. Versus, I think you mentioned earlier in the medical field, you might be actually interacting with patients. Is that also a factor?
That is also a factor. I think you nailed it spot on. Like for
Okay,
medical students, you may have an
great.
issue where people or the students themselves may not use their mobile much actively, but maybe rely on iPads for writing down notes or kind of
Hmm.
scribbling down a few concepts.
Hmm.
But where in computer science,
Okay.
what I've
Okay.
observed is that mostly students would rely on their laptop or desktop to code and kind of test out and problem solve. And in other majors, you may have neither. You may just have more mobile usage. It really depends on kind of the student persona there. But I would say liberal arts is a good average of all these scenarios. So I think that's a good starting point. Now, with that being said, I think the thing I would want to kind of categorize is kind of the platform. So we have, I think I kind of mentioned these, but we have desktop, we have mobile, we also have other kind of platforms like iPad, but for the sake of this question, at least, I would like to consider desktop and mobile since they're most commonly used. And given the scenario that not many people have iPads, not many of these students may have them. So that'd be fair.
Sure, yeah, I think it's okay to standardize amongst desktop and mobile, and we don't have to consider fancy things like IoT devices or anything like that. So, desktop and mobile it is.
Perfect. With that being said, I think the next thing I would like to do and start off and break down is the day to day schedule of the average graduate student. That'll help us kind of understand how many hours do they actually put into online usage, and how many hours they spend on offline usage. That'd be fine.
Yes?
So let's assume, as an average human being, student or non student, the person sleeps 8 hours per day. So that gives us around 16 hours of active awake time. Let's say in these 16 hours that the person the person spends some time eating breakfast, getting ready, having lunch, having dinner. So let's take an hour for each, maybe 3 hours. So how much does it leave both with? 13 hours. For the sake of kind of recreation and hobbies, let's kind of remove another 3 hours since people may want to go to the gym or kind of do other activities, maybe have play some sport. If not, do some other activity which is individualistic to that person. So I'm going to remove another 3 hours from that. That gives us a total of 10 hours for us to work with. So I think the interesting scenario here is that classes and how much time do classes take per day. So I'm going to assume, for the sake of this exercise, we can do either the weekday or the weekend because they both have different structures. But for the sake of this exercise, I would propose we would do their normal school day. Would that be fine with you?
Sure. Yeah, we can always talk about that at the end, where potentially we can make different estimates and stuff like that.
Perfect. Yep. For the sake of this question, moving ahead with the school day, let's assume maybe I know that some students take a higher course load per semester, so they may have maybe 6 hours, 8 hours of classes. I remember I had semesters where I would spend a majority of my time in classes, but I also have semesters where my friends and I used to spend maybe not that much time, maybe 4 hours in classes. So why don't I take the middle ground here and say 6 hours of classwork per day, which I'm actively in class? Would that be fine as an assumption?
So if classes are about 1 hour long, or maybe they're different in your experience in graduate school, you're assuming that around a graduate student is taking about 6 classes per day.
I would not assume 6 classes per day because the typical, at least to my anecdotal experience, classes were really long when you take a 4 credit course. They typically range between 3 hour seminars where you have some series of like mini group discussions, all these other activities, but they usually take 3 hours. I think 1 hour is too small for credit course, but let's assume each one is about 3 hours. So that's like two courses per day, different kinds rotating depending on the
Okay,
need. Would that be fair?
sure, sure.
Okay, that gives us 6 hours of class time and 4 hours of, let's assume, study time because we already have taken out hobbies. We already taken out kind of day to day usage like eating, socialization, etc. So let's say 4 hours of active study time to prepare and get ready for these classes. Would you say that's fair?
That's fair.
Okay. Okay, now comes the interesting part. How do we categorize these in terms of desktop versus mobile? So, the thing with classes is that most professors, at least most likely to my anecdotal experience, would not want people actively using their mobile devices in class unless they have a really good reason to. Um, and we have an edge case scenario where people kind of you still use their mobile phone kind of actively and just put it on the side or do whatever they want, but they're not actively kind of fully engaged on it. So I'm going to remove that edge case scenario and consider that people have their laptops open at least for a majority of these 6 hour sessions because they're taking notes, they're referencing something. Most people have their laptops open, but may not actively use it. So would you say a good active usage here would be 4 hours within these 6 hours of classes and 2 hours of just non-active passive usage where the laptop is in standby? Would you say that's a good assumption?
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. And feel free, by the way, to just assume things, and I will jump in if I have questions around where that rationale is coming from.
Perfect. Now, with that freedom, I'm going to assume that 4 hours of active desktop usage out of those 6 hours and 2 hours of standby. And the remaining 4 hours, I would want to assume, since it's preparing and studying, I would say it's a mix of both mobile and desktop usage. So I would say 2 more hours of mobile usage per day, and I would say 2 hours of laptop usage. So that gives us a total of 6 hours per day of active laptop or desktop usage and 2 hours of mobile usage.
I would be curious about the mobile usage, right? Anecdotally speaking, just looking at screen time numbers, they're far above 2 hours, probably for most folks. How do you square that, and how would you consider that, or yeah, would you push back? I'm curious where that 2 hours is, how you're justifying the 2 hours here.
That's a good question. I would say on the lower spectrum, a typical student could have a scenario where they're not actively checking their phone and sitting on their phone. They could just use it in between bus rides, use it between kind of coffee breaks for a few minutes, and that all adds up to 2 hours of a time. Sometimes they have a quick thing they want to check on their phones or kind of a video they want to watch for a quick relaxing break. So I see why your question is coming from, and I do agree on the point. So why don't I do this? Why don't I keep the 2 hours as active, meaning that people use it on an active basis, but remember the 3 hours I kind of subtracted at the beginning? which was mostly hobbies and recreation, I did also want to consider, since you mentioned it, that sometimes people rely on their mobile devices and depend on many social network platforms as recreational activities, but not everyone. So why don't I kind of push that a bit more, since we're definitely seeing more screen time, to saying, let's add another 2 hours of those 3 hours. So that brings up the total mobile hours per day to 4. And I think that's a good
Okay.
total screen time per day, not considering the too
Okay.
many extreme cases for the typical graduate student. Do you say that's fair?
Okay. Great. I think that sounds much more fair.
Awesome. So now that gives us a total of 10 hours per day on active internet usage for both devices combined. With that being said, I think the next step is for us to break down the activities associated with each device. And we can clump them together, but I want to kind of lay out my kind of perspectives on these activities. Would you agree?
Perfect.
So, out of the 6 desktop hours, what I've kind of came up with and assumed is, let's say the student uses 3 hours of the desktop or the laptop time to kind of watch videos regarding the lecture while inside kind of class, or maybe not in class, maybe spend some time just watching informational videos, which are related to class, that is. And I would say the remaining 3 hours would be spent on taking notes, kind of writing up a few papers, drafting up a few ideas, and other miscellaneous activities, checking your email, etc. Would you say those are fair assumptions?
Yeah.
Okay. And for the mobile side, I think this is where it gets interesting. I would say 2 hours of miscellaneous activities. This could be something like texting, um, maybe responding to a few friends, etc. And 2 hours of active social media feed, which is pretty maybe content heavy. This could be anywhere from watching a video on YouTube, which is played in high quality, or something even as watching a few Instagram reels or TikTok reels. I'm not sure if TikTok is still available, but um, something of that kind. Would you say that's fair?
That's fair.
Now, I think the next step is to kind of make an assumption of what's the bandwidth of these individual activities, and kind of use that as a data point for us to get started. I would say for the desktop scenario, just 3 hours of browsing and maybe surfing the web could take anywhere from 1 Mbps per kind of I would say the interval of time, and this time, let's say, is kind of 1 minute. So per minute, I would say 1 Mbps. For kind of miscellaneous activities like drafting up a paper, Google Docs, slides, or whatever kind of or operational tools you're using, maybe another 1 Mbps for the sake of simplicity. And for, I would say, the mobile scenario, I've estimated the high quality videos, maybe something like a high quality video on YouTube or other social media platforms, could be 5 Mbps per minute. And the other thing about social media, which is kind of like you see high quality reels, sometimes you don't, you scroll down and watch a few high quality pictures. I want to take maybe not 5, but somewhere around 3 Mbps. Would you say that those are fair assumptions?
Mhm.
Okay. Now, with that being said, let's do some math. So I'm going to walk you through it. So I would say for the first person of the desktop, which is 3 hours. So that's 3 hours times 1 Mbps. That's equal to 3 GB. For browsing as well, we have another 3 GB. For mobile, considering random social media videos, pictures, reels, we have 3 hours of that. Sorry, we have 2 hours of that. So that's 2 hours times 3 Mbps. That's equal to 6 GB per day. And we have high quality video. So that's 2 hours of high quality video times 5 Mbps. That's equal to 10 gigabytes per day. So how much does that give us if we sum all these together? So we have 3 plus 3, that is 6 total for desktop. And we have 6 plus 10, which is 16 total for mobile. That's roughly equal to 22 GB per day per student on average in this scenario. And I think the first and primary topmost question was, how about, okay, you got it for one student, but what is it for 1,000 students? So that's 22 gigabytes times 1,000 per day, which is equal to roughly 22 terabytes per day. I think this metric gives us a good average considering the assumptions we made and the methodology we used. But I do want to raise some concerns on a few risks here. But before I do so, do you have any follow up questions to that? Did the math make sense? Open for your feedback.
Yeah, I think the math made a lot of sense, and great that you recalled the 1,000 student prompt. I am curious where you think, and maybe this leads to the next portion you're about to cover, but um, where do you think that some of this estimation could have gone wrong or could have been improved?
I think that's a good question. I think this goes back to the sanity check. So I think the first and most important thing are the assumptions that we take in mind. I think the scope of considering liberal arts students as the average kind of graduate level student is kind of maybe not the best way of estimating this question. I would say if I had more time and if I were an actual PM investigating this issue, I would take a random average of students. So I would take 100 medical students, I would take 100 liberal arts students, I would take 100 maybe chemistry or psychology students, and so on. So I get a good distribution of these random people. And I would actually dive deep into some of these personas and maybe have surveys to understand their typical behavior and maybe average all that together and remove kind of the standard deviation. So we have a better understanding of these different students in real sense. That gives us a more accurate representation of a good student base. So that's something which I would definitely improve if I had more time. And the second thing which really concerns me here in this estimation is the assumption of how people use their time. I've seen students, I know in this example, we took 6 hours of desktop and 4 hours of mobile. I've seen scenarios where people may not really depend on desktop, maybe not spend more than 2, 3 hours per day. But I've seen scenarios where people would spend a lot of time on mobile. And the same other way around. I was seeing people, maybe a group of students in a particular field, refrain from using mobile too much and spend a majority of their time on desktop. Take computer science students, for example. A lot of their time is spent on coding and problem solving, preparing for interviews, testing out their code, etc. So you don't see many of these people kind of interact with their mobile device too much as compared to the desktop. So just that one example can give you a lot of info on the type of variations of how people use their mobile OS desktop. So I would say, once again, if I had more time, I would kind of have a better representation and kind of use that to classify how to measure these 1,000 graduate students. And the final thing, if those two made sense, I will stop there before you have any questions before I talk about the third thing I would improve.
No, please go ahead. Go ahead.
Yep. The third thing I would improve is the actual measure of data. So I think at the beginning of the conversation, I mentioned we were assuming this is in the United States. I do understand that depending on the location of the university, the graduate program, students have different behaviors. They have different sleep schedules. They have different customs to what they're accommodating to. Um, and even the minor factors like weather could affect a lot about how students spend their day, and even how much sunlight is coming to the day, how much like nighttime is during the day. There's so many um, dependent variables here to consider. So I would consider all these into consideration when making these large claims, and would actually get a accurate data point on how much bandwidth on average is taken per activity in much more critical detail. I know we made assumptions about 1 Mbps on for active surfing. I think it may be more. I made that basic assumption, but I would get those numbers really accurate so we can have a really good, concrete mathematical and data driven way to estimate this. So I would definitely improve on these 3 to 4 points if I had more time.
Thanks, Rakesh. So why don't we move on to, let's consider the mock closed. Let's move on to the feedback portion. Do you have any quick feedback besides the stuff that you mentioned earlier for yourself? And then I'll dive into the what an interviewer rubric feedback might look like for you.
I think I would have spent some more time on asking a few more clarifying questions. I think I have done a decent job, but would have focused a bit more on kind of getting those really crisp and clear. And maybe I would have spent a bit more time on kind of laying out my methodology of selecting and choosing a few assumption based numbers on how people spend their day. I know that for the sake of this exercise and for the sake of kind of the simplicity of it, me wanting to get a more of an average figure in the way, I chose a few assumed numbers. So definitely spend more time thinking about my thought process in doing so. I think I would also consider a few more edge cases. So I know that the numbers here are really simple and straightforward, but what I would do is consider edge cases. Whereas, what about if students or these graduate level students are in a time of study or in maybe end of semester exams, or maybe something like summer break? That greatly affects a lot of these estimations. And I would consider different cases for all these and maybe combine them at the end. But that complicates a lot of things. So I think that complication is sometimes necessary to get a more crisp answer, but would have done that. But yeah, I think those are the things I think I would reflect about myself if are on top of my head. But what do you think?
Perfect. Yeah, so I actually thought you did a really great job, especially on the clarification. This question is deceptively simple, and so I think you hit on some of the major points, which I'll get to in a second. Things that I thought you did well, Rakesh. So first of all, great job scoping down the problem and making it a lot more manageable, right? And you did that in the clarification section. You talked about liberal arts students. I might have just kept it a little bit more general, right? Like something about students who spend a lot of time on their laptops or in the office as opposed to out of the office, i.e. lawyers, doctors, et cetera, et cetera. So that might have been a little bit too niche, but overall still fine. The devices that one uses and the scheduling was all super clear as well. So I appreciated that. Number two, I thought you did a really great job rolling with the punches for when the interviewer pushes back. And when you get to more advanced level interviews, that is going to happen much more frequently. And I thought you did so with a really positive attitude and was able to come back with a coherent answer. And then number three, I thought you did a great job in this section where you called out where the estimation could have gone wrong. And that's definitely a more advanced estimation tactic, right? Where you are proactively telling the interviewer, hey, this isn't perfect. If I had XYZ data, this is what I would be looking into. Obviously, no one's going to know a lot of this off the top of their head. And I want to call out that most people are not going to know bandwidth and megabits per second and what is a sort of reasonable Mbps. So that could have been something someone clarifies at the beginning of an interview as well. No one is expecting you to memorize these numbers. Okay, so those are on the positives. On the things that you could have improved. So this is a more minor presentation point, Rakesh, and this is something a lot of people struggle with, but you have a bit of upspeak, which means that your tone goes up at the end of your sentences. So for example, you would say mobile usage, desktop usage. In general, when you lift the tone at the end of the sentence, it sounds like a question and it's not as confident sounding. So I'd practice downspeak more. Again, a lot of people face that issue. I do that sometimes too, so don't feel like it's something that is something you can't overcome, right? Everyone does this.
Exactly.
Number two is try to be more proactive with things in general, right? So whether it's I think I was the one who prompted you to say, hey, where could these things go wrong? Or I think in general, it's like, hey, I'll jump in if I have any concerns. And then you still consistently ask, does that sound good with you? Which is a good technique to check in with the interviewer. But maybe you can do so by saying, hey, I'm going to move on to the next section if that's all right with you. Or just tell me what you're going to do next instead of just stopping and saying, hey, does that sound good with you? Right. So it's already great that you're checking in. That's definitely necessary, but do so in a more proactive manner, either by calling out some risks and considerations and or just moving the interview along. The reason that's important is as a PM, you want to be seen as a leader. You want to be seen as someone who can rally the crowd and rally the conversation. So that would help with an interviewer being more confident in your skill sets for this role. And then the final thing I would say is this question can be very convoluted, and the interviewer can lose the structure very quickly. And so I would recommend some sort of visual asset to go along with this type of question. Of course, we're doing this virtually. In person, there's whiteboards, there's paper, stuff like that. But to the extent that you can, either screen share and or lift up your piece of paper that you're working on and show me the mathematical equation you're drawing out. That would help me follow along a little bit better, because I will admit, once it was the middle section and we're making all these assumptions, et cetera, it's very easy to get lost.
I agree.
But that said, overall, Rikesh, I thought you did a fantastic job, and I really appreciate you coming in to chat with us today. Any last thoughts you want to share?
Well, I would like to thank you, Kevin, for kind of helping me with this exercise. I felt great. It was refreshing, and I had a great time with it.
Likewise.